Chris join us once again. Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Peter. It's an honor to be here. It's been a while since we last talked, and a lot of progress has happened, so I'm excited to update everyone.
Well, it's certainly been a while since we last had you on, and I had the privilege of meeting you in London when you were over at the art conference and showing you around some history in London. That was good fun to meet you, but I have watched what you've done, and I'm in awe of your travels, of your input that you put into this issue, which is essential issue, not only to those who are parents, but any sane-minded individual. So the privilege and honor is all mine, Chris, having you on to discuss what you are doing. And again, today, we're recording this International Women's Day, and I've seen some great pictures pointing out, I think, just start on that, how women are being airbrushed out of society, where men can, all the rights they fought for, and then men can step in and then take on that role and claim to be them. So it is a little bit ironic, I thought, that we were filming this on International Women's Day.
Yeah, I remember in 2020, before I had put up my first actual billboard on International Women's Day, I remember the UN Women's Group, whatever it's called. They celebrated International Womexens Day, WOMXN, because they need to include all women, including the men. And I just thought, this world, we cannot live in this kind of world. This is so nuts. And back then I was still learning all about what was going on with kids and kind of obsessing over it every night. My wife would be marking homework and I'd be reading about this stuff. I thought I was losing my mind a little bit. But yeah, it's been quite a journey since then. And I think there's been a lot of pushback against that. I don't see as much of that virtue signaling from these leftist organizations as I used to, actually.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, maybe we can start there, because it is difficult as an activist, and people obviously at Billboard Chris can find you there and your many phenomenal videos of conversations with the public as you confront them with the reality and get them to question the lunacy that they're seeing. And some of those, many of the conversations are pure gold dust. They are so good. But what about you, just generally? Because when you take an issue like this, it is so disturbing. It is so essential. You're fighting against the mad woke agenda that's coming. You're constantly being told you're not accepting, you're hateful, you're all of that. I mean, for you as an individual, it can be difficult, I'm sure, to keep that campaigning side, to keep that drive side, and not overwhelmed with the kind of onslaught you face and the dark subject that you look into. I mean, let us know what that is like for you, keeping sane in the insanity.
What a great question. I don't get this sort of question very much. I don't worry at all about the hate. It doesn't bother me. And I think I'm just wired that way. The hate and all that doesn't really affect me too much. It's probably just my personality type. But when you're really focused on a mission, which is what I am, you just don't worry about the noise. I don't care what happens. The other day in my neighborhood, my whole neighborhood was sent mail. Paid mail with a bad picture of me, my address, my phone number, all this hate propaganda, a link to a hate website. And that's a little bit bothersome because it worries my wife and kids. But all that ends up happening from that is people go, what the heck is this? Who is this guy? They Google me, and then I get more support. And at the dog park, which is 100 meters away from my house, the people are all talking about it and they learn the truth. So that's just cheap intimidation tactics. And I knew when I signed up for this, what was going to happen. I knew all the far left they were going to come for me, but it is what it is. This is a war for our kids. And sometimes you have to make a tiny bit of sacrifice. Our grandfathers stormed the beaches of Normandy, running into machine gun fire. I go outside and have conversations. it's really not that scary.
Because the trans lobby do seem to be more vile and aggressive and I guess fairly hateful to anyone else who disagrees. And when you look at the woke agenda on many aspects, to me, actually, it's the trans lobby that seemed to be, I guess, the most militant. Is that what you kind of come across?
Oh, 100%. I say all the time, trans activists are the most violent group of people in the Western world. They cannot have a rational conversation. Their only effort is to try to silence conversation. And the only reason this ideology ever had success in the first place was basically because it was able to grow in silence without opposition. If anyone said anything, they were anti-LGBTQ. And that silences a lot of people. And they were able to conflate gay rights with so-called trans rights. But these two things have almost nothing to do with each other. I say almost nothing because historically, a lot of people with gender dysphoria grew up to be gay. Now they're telling these kids who might grow up to be gay, that they're really trans, that they were born wrong, and that they need to alter their body. There's no such thing as transitioning to the opposite sex. All this is body modification. And they're doing that to kids. And, you know, you see these polls where they say that people are happier after they transition. Well, of course, people are going to say that when you ask them in a poll. They're chasing this fantasy. It's like if you join a cult and you go ask all the cult members, are you happy? They're all going to say yes, even if they're miserable. But when you talk to these people one-on-one, as I do, they come up to me all the time. These trans-identified people on university campuses and on the street, they're not happy. They're usually yelling. They're angry. They're giving me the middle finger. Sometimes they start to cry. Sometimes they're literally shaking because they're so amped up that I dare have a sign that says children cannot consent to puberty blockers. So these people aren't happy and well adjusted. They're a mess. But if you ask them, they'll all say, yeah, it saved my life. So what they're saying and what reality are two totally different things. But we just got to keep speaking up because we're winning all over the place in various jurisdictions. Certain leftist governments and political parties are still trying to double down and make this even worse, but the people are waking up.
Well, I do want to get into some of those areas where we are waking up because often you can hear bad news and it's essential to put forward the breakthroughs and the benefits that are happening. But I want to ask you about you. We, as I said, it was a couple of months ago, 3 months ago when we met at the privilege of meeting you. And you've been traveling all over, speaking at different venues, outside, inside. Give us maybe a snapshot on, I guess there's no typical week or month, but because every conversation is with an individual and that is different, each and every one. But kind of give us a snapshot of maybe the last 2 or 3 months.
Okay, so last week I was in California for 5 days. I went to LA, then I drove to San Francisco because there was a Republican meeting going on there. And Rand Paul, who's a U.S. Senator, was there. So I met him. I talked to his wife at length. And that was a bit encouraging because she follows me and she knew who I was right away. So you never realize who you're reaching. And when you're reaching U.S. senators and their spouses and they're big supporters of you, that's an encouragement for sure. Then I drove all the way back down to San Diego and I had conversations in the gay district in San Diego and then in the park there. And that was encouraging because when I go into the gay villages in different cities, and I don't do it a lot because it can get violent, it can get nasty, and I'm not really in it for that. But I do feel it's important to have conversations in those places because, as I said previously, a lot of these kids who would just grow up to be gay are being convinced that they're trans. And so they need to have this conversation in those communities as much as anywhere. But I was encouraged because I didn't get much hate there at all. I got a lot of support. A lot more than I would get in Vancouver, for example. So I can see month to month the change in the overall awareness. This entire campaign, I've been doing this for 3.5 years, and the difference is phenomenal. So yeah, I had that week down there. I started off the year with a conference in Washington, D.C. at the Heritage Foundation, which is the most successful, biggest conservative think tank. And they brought in about 150 people from across America who were fighting this. So that's great for networking because we're all more effective when we work together. I've spent a bit of time in California this year because there's a ballot initiative going on where if they get enough signatures, when people go to vote for president this year, even though the government will never change the laws surrounding child transition, the people can write their own laws. They just have to get enough signatures to get it on the ballot. And they'd be able to vote to stop child transition, to get boys out of girls' sports, and to stop teachers in schools from hiding from parents when their own child has a new name and pronouns. So that would be just a monumental blow. That would be like an earthquake for these trans activists, because winning in California, this has been unheard of. People can't imagine that happening. And I know it would happen if we can get it on the ballot, but I'm a little bit discouraged because not enough money has come in to help make it happen, because you need to be able to hire signature gathering firms to gather the signatures. You can't get 550,000 signatures just with grassroots efforts, really. So I don't think they're going to get there this time, but in 2 years, we can try again for the midterm elections. And where else have I been? I've been around. I can't even remember all the places. I'm going to Nashville next month. I'm there for a conference. I'll do some stuff on the street. I'm heading to Australia next month. I'm really excited about that. That'll be a 10-day trip in Melbourne and Sydney. And I'm going to be heading back to your neck of the woods, England and Dublin, probably in June or July. But every month I take one trip, maybe a week, and another trip, maybe 3 or 4 days, if that. And yeah, it's just been really successful, especially the last year, because now when I go somewhere, media will come out with me. So then they're covering these conversations, they're featuring it on their own networks. So I'm able to leverage what I'm doing with different friends I have in media. And online now, these videos that I record are being seen, sometimes 1 million, 2 million, 5 million times, and it's helping educate a lot of people.
Is your focus on media because you're going to events, you're speaking to like-minded people to help equip them, to give them the energy to keep going because they're told you're wrong, you're failing, leave the kids alone, and that phrase is used on the other side, it's bonkers. But and people can feel demoralized. You go and encourage. You're going to key influencers. You mentioned Rand Paul, but you're also it's, to me, actually, it's the media that actually connects direct to the people. I mean, is it a combination of so many aspects because the battle is multifaceted?
That's right. So when I first started, I was just talking to people on the street. I wasn't recording any conversations. I might take a picture and tweet it out just to let people know I was out there. But I was happy just doing that, just reaching people one-on-one on the street, especially parents, so they can protect their kids. But when I started recording primarily to protect myself because I was getting attacked and people lie about me and whatever, and I started posting these conversations, that just really helped people learn how to talk about this. And so that's extremely valuable, because when people don't know how to talk about something, they won't talk about it. And this subject of child transition is a little bit complicated. People get confused. There's a lot of lies out there. So this is really just an education campaign. And the videos are very successful, and also helping to educate all the different conservative podcasters and media members, because most of the mainstream media won't touch this, although they're even starting to now. New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters, they've all told the truth about this. And so, yeah, it is totally multifaceted. And then another part of what I do is I'm trying to activate other people to take action, because I can only talk to so many people, but I've made great relationships with all sorts of organizations. Moms for Liberty, for example, they have 130,000 moms in their organization. They weren't talking about this at all until I happened to run into the co-founder one night in a Twitter space back in November of 2021. And I told her what I was doing, and she became a good friend. And now they're fighting this big time, having a lot of success. I'm helping to train people when they run for school boards on how to talk about this issue. I was just invited to Harvard last month. I was there at a conference, and I also spoke with the student newspaper there. So they're going to be writing a piece on this. So then that'll go out to a lot of the students and also a lot of the alumni. And that's a pretty big deal, because yes, I know Harvard has all sorts of problems, but these are still great institutions with a lot of good people and a lot of influential people. And so when they can learn the truth about this, you're just creating ripples, and you never know where those ripples are going to lead. So, for example, there's a law firm now in Texas. 4 dads all left their previous law firms to start a new one just to sue for these detransitioners. And they have 17 kids between them. This isn't about chasing money. This was a calling for them. These are really good guys. I know them. And all of this happens because of the awareness campaign that a lot of people are involved in. And that's an example of people getting activated and taking on this cause themselves.
Because I saw one of your tweets a week or so ago, was the pushback against child transition is coming from many directions now. Lawyers are starting to sue for the kids who have been harmed. Politicians are legislating an end to it. Medical bodies in other countries are stopping it. Malpractice insurance premiums are rising. It is exciting. You mentioned the actually using the legal system, the courts, to actually hold these individuals to account. That is exciting, and that is definitely a breakthrough and something completely different to what we would have seen a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so there's currently 11 lawsuits going on for these detransitioners. There are 6 more in the works. And just yesterday, I heard from my friends at Campbell Miller Payne, if people want to look them up. These are the 4 dads. They just took on a case of a suicide in California. So I guess they're suing for the family of someone who transitioned and then committed suicide. So lawfare is extremely important, obviously. You need to hit these people in the pocketbooks. You need to hit their insurance companies in the pocketbooks. And previously in the United States, I do a lot of my work in the US just because they're the most influential in the world.
Yep.
And there's a lot more people fighting this down there as well. And when good things happen in the US, it spreads to other countries. It's spreading to Canada. The rest of the world takes notice. But there was legislation passed in the state of Missouri, which extended the statute of limitations that people could sue for medical malpractice. Previously, up until the last year or two, in all 50 states, the statute of limitations was only 1 to 3 years, depending on the state. Now they're extending that out 20, 30 years for these kids who've been harmed. And when they passed this legislation in Missouri, no new kids could go to the gender clinic to get puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or surgeries. But all the existing patients were still allowed to keep going. But because of the legal liability now extending so many years, the lawyers for the gender clinic shut it down because they didn't want the legal liability.
Wow.
So they didn't even have to stop those kids going themselves. The gender clinic did it on their own. And this is going to spread. There's no doubt. And even when, so far, it's only been the Republican states that are passing legislation to stop this child abuse. But the insurers aren't just incorporated in that state. Many of them are federally incorporated. Their business crosses state lines. So you start hitting them in the pocketbooks, they're going to start shutting this down. And we even have the Democrats, and I don't want to make this a political issue, but at the political level, it is.
Yeah.
On the street level, it's not as much. Most people who vote Democrat will support me.
Yeah. But
in the political realm, none of them will. So what some of these states are doing, like in Rhode Island right now, they're trying to pass legislation so that these gender doctors can't be sued.
Wow.
Just yesterday, they were holding hearings in Rhode Island. They're doing the same thing in California. What? When you have to do that, you know you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
So we need to push back against this. They're going to have some victories in the short term, but in the long term, they cannot stop this wave of outraged people, especially parents, because we are never going to unlearn what we've learned, and we're just going to keep learning more and more about these atrocities.
I want to talk to you about information, how it gets out, because often you have information that's leaked in the great work that James O'Keefe does, for instance, Project Veritas, and now with OMG Media. That sort of journalism that we've kind of lost, really, of exposing and getting the story out. And there's been something that I have come across, now we talked about a little bit before, and I've glanced at it but haven't delved into it, and that's the WPATH files, which is leaked information coming out. Do you want to just let us know what that is? Because this seems to be another part of the dam being broken.
Sure. So I still need to read them all, but these are videos. that were leaked from an internal conference of these so-called trans health professionals all across the US, and several internal emails exposing that what they say publicly is not at all what they say privately. They admit to themselves that children are not capable of giving informed consent. What 14-year-old understands what it means to throw away their fertility? None of them. You ask a 20-year-old woman if she wants to have kids, many of them will say no. And then when they're 30, they're chomping at the bit to have kids because people change, they grow up, they mature. This is the natural cycle of things. But you're not just discussing normal, healthy 14-year-old kids. You're talking about kids who have, on average, Peter, 5 or more coexisting mental health comorbidities: autism, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, borderline personality disorder. Parents, especially moms with borderline personality disorder. An older study into gender identity disorder revealed that 52% of the moms had borderline personality disorder. You've got kids coming straight from the psychiatric wards of hospitals into the gender clinic. And they're sterilizing these children. Girls who've been sexually abused, boys too. In Washington State, a therapist just blew the whistle on this last month. She was being told to affirm this girl's gender identity, that she was really a boy, even though this girl had been raped by her stepfather. Her mother is crazy, and she grew up watching hardcore porn that her mother was showing her. This girl was identifying as a cat and wouldn't speak as a human. She was meowing. And the therapist, the psychologist, quite rightly said, no, we should not be affirming this girl. There are obviously other things going on here. But the opinion amongst all of her colleagues was the other things don't matter. You still affirm the gender.
Wow.
This is totally insane. These people are crazy, Peter. They are in a cult for all practical purposes. And they're even doing what are called nullification surgeries. For someone who thinks that they're non-binary, they'll just remove their womb or remove all of their genitals. And they're doing this to kids. They're castrating 16-year-old boys and creating these so-called neo-vaginas, which are really just wounds. And I tweeted out this story yesterday of a boy, a young man. He started transitioning when he was a boy, who he left a review for one of these doctors who was featured in the WPATH files. And what happened is a woman who saw these WPATH files looked up this doctor online, and she looked up the doctor's reviews in California, and she stumbled upon this terrible review where this boy had been castrated. They'd created this neo-vagina, but they had obviously used some of his colon to create it, which is what they do when boys are put on puberty blockers. Because when they're put on puberty blockers, their penis doesn't grow, so they don't have enough tissue to form this neo-vagina. So they'll cut out some of the boy's colon. This boy's colon was spilling out of him. He was getting blood clots. He thought he was going to die. He wanted to get reconstructive surgery, but no surgeons would do it. And upon further looking into this, he thought he was going to die. And then when you Google his name, he died later that year. There's an obituary for him. We found more information online, including emails that surgeons had sent to him denying him care. So these are the stories you never hear about in the media. What the left tries to say is that if we don't transition kids, they're going to kill themselves. But all the evidence points to the exact opposite. And also, just in the last couple weeks, we have the first of its kind, a study into childhood suicide rates. Because the number one thing that the left always say, what these trans activists always say, is if you don't transition kids, they're going to kill themselves. Every single conversation, Peter. And this study was done in Finland. It followed. So this was over a course of 20 years. They looked at all the data in the medical records, more than 2,000 children who had transitioned. And then they used a control group of almost 17,000 patients who had not transitioned. And they looked at the suicide rates between the two. the suicide rate was higher among the kids who were transitioning, getting puberty blockers and all that. It was 0.3% over that entire span versus 0.1% for the general population. But when you compare the kids who were transitioning to kids with other mental health problems in the general population, it was the same. So they're not killing themselves because they can't transition. This very small percentage of children who do commit suicide are doing it because they have these other mental health problems. And at the Tavistock in the UK, in England, over 10 years, from 2010 to 2020, there were only 4 suicides at the Tavistock. 2 were on the waiting list, which is now 15,000 children, and 2 were getting care. Care. I call it care. It's not care. They call it care. It's not care. 2 of them were getting puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones. They were getting child abuse is what they were getting. So that suicide rate worked out to 0.008 or something. I can't remember what it was, but it's a tiny fraction of the population. The whole thing is a myth. But anyway, I've gone off on a tangent here. But there's a lot of good news happening. These studies are being done. Germany, just in the last week as well, conducted a systematic review. They looked at all the scientific literature. They found this wasn't helping kids psychologically. Same thing that Sweden, England, and Finland have already done.
But yeah, to tell us that pushback against puberty blockers, because the UK was confusing because the British government said you can't use puberty blockers for children unless some strange circumstances, but by and large, but yet it still seems to be used because the Tavistock Clinic obviously shut down, and then most of those doctors have gone elsewhere. But that is movement, and it does seem to be there. A lot of other countries following. You mentioned Finland and Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Germany, France have been talking about that. There does seem to be a lot of wake up across countries. Which is, I think you make this comment on some of your tweets, which is happening in Europe, and yet not and often we look across the pond, we look across to the US for some common sense on what is happening here in Europe. But it seems though Europe is maybe leading the way on wakening up and stopping children being given these dangerous drugs. Is that the case?
So when it comes to medical professionals, to the medical bodies, yes, absolutely. Now, there are no outright bans in these countries. England is, some of the existing patients are still being seen and treated in this way. They're not taking on any new patients. Finland basically dramatically reduced the number of kids, and they made it so that no cross-sex hormones could be given until the age of 16. But they have to rule out all the other mental health comorbidities, such as autism and abuse and trauma and all that sort of stuff. So they've drastically reduced the number. It's not perfect. They shouldn't be doing this at all to kids. But it's a vast improvement, and it will continue to improve. In the United States, it's been a different situation. It's been legislators putting a stop to this, because the medical bodies, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, they are run by ideologues who refuse to look at the evidence. And they say they follow the standards of care from WPATH, which is why these files that were just leaked in this last week are so important, because they're a bunch of liars. And we can prove it all day long. The president of WPATH, a man who says he's a woman, named Marcy Bowers, admits on this call, and I've tweeted this out before, this was one bit that had been leaked out prior. He admits that none of the boys, actually this is a different call, but he admits again, none of the boys who get puberty blockers at Tanner stage 2, which is the beginning of puberty, have been able to have an orgasm as an adult. So of course, children cannot consent to that. They don't even know what it means. Jazz Jennings, this now young man who was transitioned as a child, had his transition celebrated on TV for the last 10 years. They performed this surgery on him when he was a minor. I mean, this is just gruesome stuff. They're celebrating this child abuse on TV, getting big ratings. It's insane. But people are finally waking up. So, yeah, the states that have legislated a stop to this, really, that's a Band-Aid solution, but it's a Band-Aid that has to be applied for now. Ultimately, what we need are the medical bodies to look at the evidence and admit, finally, that this isn't helping these children. And there is some good news on that front. The American Academy of Pediatrics announced a few months ago that they're conducting a systematic review. So a systematic review is they just look at all the different studies. In Sweden, they looked at 195 different studies, and they found this wasn't helping kids. I don't trust the AAP to do it honestly, but we'll see what happens. But this is still a response to all the pressure that's been on them. And there's going to be a lot more pressure on WPATH now. These files, they're not going away. We're going to be contacting legislators. I'll be doing it myself all across the country, all across the world, because all these gender clinics across the world claim to follow WPATH standards of care. And we need to educate these legislators so that they can take some action and know how to take action and know how to speak about it.
But it is really political because those medical practitioners, they have the right to practice in a country, and that right is given by a governmental body or directly from the government. So that's what has to be changed, isn't it? And I assume, I'm praying, hoping that those legal actions that are happening, that they force the regulatory authorities in countries to actually begin to rescind some licenses for individuals that have practiced this well outside their remit.
Yeah, not just that, but what happens in these lawsuits? There's discovery, there are depositions. The AAP, WPATH, they're going to have to present their evidence for why transitioning kids is beneficial. And they don't have it because there is none. So when they start losing some of these lawsuits, if they go to trial especially, now they'll probably settle some of them, but some of these will certainly go to trial. We've already had wins in states where the ACLU sued the states for stopping child transition. So the ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union, who stand up for freedom of speech. That's what they're supposed to do. And, freedom of your people. Now they sue for the right to sterilize kids.
Wow.
Because they're completely corrupted by the far left. The far left throughout the West has taken over the entire left. The moderate Democrats who were for workers' rights and maybe they liked unions or whatever, but they're pretty normal people, they don't have a say anymore in these political parties. They're honestly being run by straight up communists in many instances. And if anyone of the more moderate disposition speaks up against this, they're canceled, they're shouted down. So they don't speak up against it. So then who ends up running things? The radicals in all these parties. And that's something that these parties are just going to have to get voted out of power and start losing before they wake up. But these communists are never going to try to give up their power. They're always going to push as hard as they can. So in addition to all this stuff going on with gender and everything, we just have these radicals running all these political parties, pushing queer theory into society, trying to make pedophilia normalized, trying to disrupt all norms that we've ever known, as though they're oppressive of some sort. This neo-Marxism, as people call it. It's not just based on, financial, you don't have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. You have oppressors and oppressees based on sexuality, based on gender, based on race. And the far left is pushing all of this. So in the bigger picture, we also have to fight back against that because that's been another contributing factor to this.
One other, I don't know if you've followed, obviously I'm here in Europe and deep into politics. I don't know how closely you followed it, but we are expecting to see massive changes in the European Parliament elections coming up in 2 months. And a lot of the governments are in utter panic because it's a rise of the populist right for everything that means, but it will be a majority for the first time in the European Parliament. And one thing that ties a lot of those parties together is that a massive pushback on what has happened on this trans ideology, especially looking at children, looking at the benefit of the family unit, all of that. And I don't know if you looked at this, but I just want to say that I think we could see a massive change in Europe post those May elections, when a lot of the parties will end up top. I mean, there's election coming up in Portugal, and the one party that is actually speaking up loudly on issues like this has come from nowhere to probably 18%. And I think we are seeing a massive breakthrough across Europe.
That's really encouraging. And this is the pendulum swinging back because it went too far. And it takes a while. It takes years for for the normies, the people who don't pay attention to all this politics. They go to work, they come home, they take care of the kids, put the kids to bed, they watch a show, they go to bed. That's most people. They're not involved in all of this day to day. But they're all waking up because they see what's going on in schools. They see the politicization of schools. They see queer theory being pushed on their kids. I say all the time, in the United States, the demographics that traditionally vote Democrat, Black community, Hispanic community, immigrant communities, they're my number one supporters.
That's true, I guess.
By far. Almost none of them support this. It's white progressives pushing this. Gender ideology is really a white person problem. And it's primarily pushed by young white women who are naturally more agreeable. And this preys on their empathy. They're being deceived in schools and in universities and in the workplace. They're being deceived to think that this is helping children to be who they really are. And they want to be empathetic. And they're told that kids are going to kill themselves. And they fall for this. And they end up being the ones pushing it. And if you look at this like a cult, which I do, well, the victims of the cult always become the recruiters for the cult. And that same exact cycle is happening here. These people get deceived, they get sucked into this false ideology, and then they become the ones recruiting for it. So we have to break that cycle, which is another reason I go to university campuses a lot, because that's where this is really being pushed and taught, and where a lot of these young people are being indoctrinated, and they never have a conversation about the other side, the truth. So I'll show up on a campus. I might only talk to 20 or 30 people, but there's 1,000 kids talking about me there because they all see this crazy looking guy who's the weirdo in a sandwich board with a sign that says children cannot consent to puberty blockers. And so it starts conversations all over campus. And, you never know where those ripples lead. I get emails sometimes. I was at a university a year ago and someone emails me yesterday saying, hey, I saw you here. I didn't know what you were all about. Just want to thank you for what you're doing. I believed in this, but I've been looking into it and following you. And I just want to thank you for your work. I get stuff like that all the time. So we're making progress.
Well, one of the things which I love about what you do is you've kept the message simple and straightforward and clear. Children cannot consent to puberty blockers. You could have added to that. You could have expanded massively. But that statement in itself is spot on. And I think it pushes through because this issue can be so disturbing. I mean, I've looked at the heroic individuals, the detransitioners like Chloe Cole and others, and you read their stories, and I've even held back on interviewing them because I feel so desperately for them, what they've gone through, and when you delve into it, it is graphic and horrendous, and yet you've managed with sound bites and having that simple message of being able to, I guess, connect with the public without actually delving into that. And I mean, have you felt pushed to go different directions to change that message, or have you found the simplicity of that actually connects with the public?
Man, I really like talking to you, Peter. You ask the best questions. I don't get these sorts of questions. So yeah, I've thought about it. I do have a few different signs, but I stick to really just that main one. Children cannot consent to puberty blockers. When other people come out with me, sometimes I might give them a sign that says children are never born in the wrong body, or gender ideology does not belong in schools. But the children cannot consent to puberty blockers is an excellent conversation starter. Because if people don't know what puberty blockers are, they'll ask me, what are those? And so then we start a conversation. And people who have learned a bit about this, well, they're almost always supportive right away. And it's just a very clear message. There's no ambiguity. It's very clear what I stand for. And the sign on my back is my definition of a dad, which is a bit playful. It's a human male who protects his kids from gender ideology. And that's my most popular one. People love that for sure. But yeah, I don't need to change the message because I travel all around. Most people have never seen me before. So for a lot of them, they're seeing it for the first time. And it works. It's very effective. So when something's working, don't change it. Just keep going. And to answer your second point about how I'm able to have these conversations and not get into all the graphic stuff, once in a while I'll get into this. We got into a little bit of it today. But when it comes to messaging, and this is another thing I try to do with politicians, the messaging on this is very important. We don't have to get all gruesome all the time, because that turns people off. Most people aren't going to want to talk about it. They'll even kind of shut their brains off. They don't want to hear it because it's just too crazy. But you can talk about this issue and still be positive, which resonates with people much more. You can say, our children are beautiful just as they are. Yeah. Bingo. Who disagrees with that? Nobody. I'll say there's no right way to be a boy or a girl. Everyone agrees with that. The most radical leftist agrees with that. So I'm not out there to reach them, and I'm not out there to change the minds of angry people on the street. You can't do that in the moment, because they're not there to have a conversation. They're there to win a conversation. But with them, I'll just say things they agree with. There's no point arguing with them. No point. Just say, yeah, our children are beautiful just as they are. There's no right way to be a girl or a boy. If a boy is a more effeminate, if a girl is more masculine, beautiful. What's wrong with that? And I'll pause. And I see the gears turning in their head. They're confused, because I'm supposed to be some bigot against gender nonconformity in their head. And I just said something that they cannot help but agree with. So in that moment, I've created this beautiful moment of cognitive dissonance, where there's two separate ideas going on in their head at the same time. This man's evil. He's a bigot. He just said exactly what I think. And they're going to have to make sense of that. They're going to have to go home and start questioning this. And if you do view this like a cult, how do you get people out of a cult? Well, you don't get them out by arguing with them. You don't get them out by telling them they're wrong or even showing them they're wrong. All these people already have questions going on in their head. But one of the aspects of cults is that people self-police their own thoughts, and they don't allow themselves to look at the truth. Because to acknowledge the truth would be to disrupt their entire social network. It might mean that they'd have to cut off family members who wouldn't talk to them anymore. And with transgenderism, well, you've got all these young people, all their friendship group is primarily online, other people identifying as trans, or maybe at school, they've joined the Gender and Sexuality Alliance Club, where they're with these other kids who are identifying as something. And these are, remember, typically the misfit kids with other mental health problems going on. They're not going to get out of this until they start questioning it themselves. So by asking questions to people and getting them to think and saying things they agree with, you start that thinking process in their head. And it might take 6 months or 3 years or 5 years, but you got to get them starting to think, because they have to come out of this on their own.
Can I just finish off with how people support what you do? Because your videos are some of those videos that really stand out, and you see them on social media, you want to share them. And that's obviously one way, sharing the information, sharing those videos, sharing news updates. That's one side people can help. But obviously traveling around the country, you're a dad, you're doing this because, well, is anyone else doing it? No, well, then I'll do it. That's how you've got into this. Not because this was your planned career in your life to wear a billboard. So tell us about billboardchris.com/donate. People can actually support you financially. Touch on that, because traveling around the country, it's not free. It's certainly not free.
It's not free, and I don't make money standing on the street. It's not the most profitable gig in the world. So... yeah, I mean, support would be great, to be honest with you. I've been losing a bunch of money lately, but yeah, I got travels coming. What I really need to do, I need to hire someone. I really need to hire someone, and I should probably just do it and bite the bullet and hope they help me to fund it more. But I can't keep up with my messages, and there's a lot more things I need to do. I don't want to just stand on the street and talk to people. There's many facets to this. There's many things that have to be done. So yeah, any support would be great, but it's fine if people can't support me. They just need to get educated on this and start having these conversations and contact their member of parliament. or contact their principal or sit down with their teacher and just keep educating people. Because I quote this speech from Javier Milei all the time, the new president in Argentina. He said he's not here to guide sheep, he's here to awaken lions. And I know for every 1,000 people I talk to, 2 or 3 of them are going to be lions, and they're going to take on this cause themselves. So when we have these conversations, you never know, again, where those ripples lead. If we stopped doing activism today, so many great things are still going to happen over the next few years because so many people have been put in motion. So many politicians have been made aware of this. We're going to keep winning these battles. And one of these days, we're going to stop the medicalization of children entirely. And I don't think it's going to take nearly as long as other people think. We can get rid of that much more quickly than we can the ideology itself. The ideology is the root of this evil that's causing all this other stuff downstream. So we need to keep educating people about how regressive and terrible this ideology is. Teaching that children are born wrong is abusive. Giving a girl he, him pronouns is abusive. And Megyn Kelly just had a great show yesterday where she got a little emotional and she kind of apologized for this segment she had when she was at NBC where she was going along with the pronouns because she thought she was being empathetic. She thought she was helping these kids. But she just actually hosted one of these lawyers that I mentioned earlier. I got them in contact with her. And she hosted a young detransitioner who's suing. Mm-hmm. And she realizes that going along with that game, playing along with the pronoun game, is leading to more harm. You're not helping these kids. You're affirming that they were born wrong. So don't do that. Don't play the pronoun game. Keep having conversations. And yeah, if you can support me, billboardchris.com, that'd be great. But please just follow me on Twitter or Instagram, and I'll have all the other social media platforms up and running soon.
Okay, well, billboardchris.com/donate, just to repeat it, because you may not want to, but I will. So that is there. All the links are in the description for all the viewers, or if you're listening on any of the podcasting apps, everything is there for you to click. Chris, it is always a privilege having you on. Thank you so much for coming on, sharing what you're doing, and also some of those changes, massive changes we are seeing actually all across. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here.